And sometimes our best work was never recorded, We were performers in Liverpool, Hamburg, and around the dance halls, and what we generated was fantastic. Well, we played straight rock, and there was nobody to touch us in Britain,
The tantalising prospect of capturing and releasing the Beatles' early live dynamic performances was actively considered. Their first UK single, Love Me Do, had been a moderate success. The second, Please Please Me, was already in the can and believed to be a surefire number one by George Martin, pending its release in the new year. It was time for the Beatles to plan their debut album. On a freezing cold Wednesday morning on the 12th of December 1962, George Martin, along with his then assistant, later wife Judy, travelled north by train to Liverpool. Brian Epstein picked them up and took them out for dinner, then on to Matthew Street. Bob Wooler recorded watching the tall man from EMI walking around the empty Cavern Club, clapping his hands and testing the echo. The low ceilings and hard surfaces created a muddled sound, one that would be nearly impossible to control for a professional quality recording. Unhappy with the acoustics, George was also concerned about the condensation dripping down from the ceiling. Health and safety in the 60s was not what it is today, but George may have been less worried about an engineer being electrocuted and more worried about EMI's expensive recording equipment being damaged. In George's autobiography, All You Need Is Ears, he wrote, "I entered their club and found it altogether unsuitable. The place was damp, hot and claustrophobic, condensation dripping from the walls. It was not a place in which EMI's equipment could safely be used." Besides, the club was so small, there probably wasn't enough room to accommodate all of the recording equipment required. The Beatles duly played their 118th evening performance at the Cavern Club, headlining alongside the Foremost and the Merseybeats. As George watched the Fab Four perform later that night in the cramped, dingy, sweaty club, a fainting girl was passed over George and Judy's heads. That was the final straw. He concluded, again in his autobiography, that the Cavern was a dreadful place. It wasn't a very good acoustic environment, not a very comfortable environment at all, really. Very grotty. Nonetheless, George was impressed by the Beatles' live performance and the idea of capturing this vitality on disc. The following day, he met with Brian at his NEMS office and explored an alternate idea of recreating a live show at Abbey Road, bussing down a load of their Liverpool fan club members. After that idea was rejected too, they settled on a conventional studio album. At least the 2 3-hour sessions booked for the new year meant that the 10 tracks needed would have to be recorded quickly, which helped to retain a live feel. The first track even had a live sounding count-in courtesy of Paul.
1, 2, 3, 4! Cause it was just 17.
Twist and Shout, recorded in one blistering take at the very end of the final session with John's failing vocal cords, preserve the raw passion of a live performance whilst achieving a sonic quality that would have been impossible at the Cavern. Brian Epstein may have had ulterior motives for getting George Martin to visit Liverpool. Before the Beatles played, he whisked George over to Birkenhead, where Jerry and the Pacemakers were playing. There and then, he agreed to sign them up and record them 2 weeks before the Beatles' own album session and before Decca got a chance to see Jerry and the Pacemakers. The Cavern Club itself fared less well than the Beatles and was closed down in 1973 and later demolished. In the end, the released Please Please Me album struck a perfect balance. It captured enough of the Beatles' live spirit whilst meeting the technical standards required for radio and record sales. The album stayed in the UK top 10 for over a year, a record which stood for well over 50 years. George Martin's December 1962 visit to the Cavern Club captures a rare moment when enthusiasm met practical limitations. It stands as a defining example of how George shaped the Beatles' early sound, combining reverence for their live presence with the control of the studio. As George Martin once remarked, in the studio, the Beatles were able to experiment, to play, to push the boundaries. That was where they truly blossomed, a view to which John agreed to some extent, whilst lamenting the loss of their live playing.
But as soon as we made it. The edges were knocked off. You know, Brian put us in suits and all that, and we made it very, very big, but we sold out, you know. And the music was dead before we even went on the theatre tour of Britain. We were feeling shit already because we had to reduce an hour or 2 hours playing, which we were glad in one way, to 20 minutes and go on and repeat the same 20 minutes every night. The Beatles' music died then as musicians. That's why we never improved, you know. As musicians, we killed ourselves then to make it. And that was the end of it. And George and I are more inclined to say that, you know. We always missed the club days because that's when we were playing music. And then later on we became technically efficient recording artists, which was another thing because we were competent people, you know, and we can, whatever media you put us in, we can produce something worthwhile, you know.
In the early stages of the Beatles' career, when, in fact, my job was rather like the BBC. In the early days, my job was just to put them in a studio and record them. And my only contributions were perhaps arranging little bits and pieces of introductions and solos and endings and that kind of thing, tidying them up, so to speak. But I think these records show just how good they were as an entity. And before we started playing all sorts of producing tricks. So I hope you like them.
George Martin would go on to record the Beatles live under very different circumstances on the Apple rooftop 6 years later.